Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the kind of Norse mythology bedtime story that doesn't just whisper you to sleep, it grabs you by the collar first. Imagine the sky tearing open, a wolf the size of a mountain biting through the sun, a serpent so vast it coils around the world and poisons the seas, and in the middle of all that chaos, one man laughing. That laughter belongs to Loki the Trickster, the outsider, the god who never quite belonged but somehow decided the fate of every other god. This isn't the Marvel version with mischief and a smirk. This is the older, stranger Loki, the one born of giants, blood brother to Odin, father of monsters, and the spark that lit the fire of Ragnarok. Tonight's story is about how someone who never held a throne still toppled every throne that ever existed. And it's a reminder that sometimes the person we laugh at, the one we dismiss, ends up holding the last punchline. So why start here, with destruction instead of creation? Because for the Norse, endings always mattered more than beginnings. The gods were never immortal. They were doomed from the start, and they knew it. That's what makes this mythology darker, sharper, and somehow more human. And when you hear it as a bedtime story, whispered in the dark, it feels less like a myth and more like a confession from history itself. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far this sleepy little time machine reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The storm quiets, the fire in the sky fades, and suddenly we're pulled backward far before Ragnarok, before the first clash of gods and giants, before Odin traded an eye for wisdom, back into the frost, into the dark. This is where Loki's story begins, not with victory, but with cold, raw survival. In Norse mythology, creation doesn't start with harmony, it starts with contradiction. To the north, Niflheim, a land of ice so ancient the rime frost piled thicker than mountains. To the south, Muspelheim fire without mercy, flames that howled as if they had a will of their own. And in the yawning gap between them, Ginnunga Gap, the great void, silent but waiting. When frost met fire in that abyss, it didn't create peace, it created tension, and tension gave birth to beings that should not exist. From this clash came the first giant, Ymir, groaning with life, monstrous and strange. He sweated children from his armpits, spawned races of frost giants with every breath. Nearby, the cow Audhumla licked salt from ice and uncovered Buri, ancestor of the gods. You can already sense it, the gods and the giants weren't so different. They were tangled from the start, family locked in feud. This is the world Loki was born into, blurred lines, messy bloodlines. His father was Farbauti, a giant whose name means cruel striker, and his mother Laufey, whose name means leafy island. Already he was both flame and leaf, destruction and fragility. From birth, Loki was marked as a contradiction, not fully giant, not fully safe among gods, but dangerous enough that everyone kept an eye on him. And then came Odin, the wanderer with his one burning eye. He saw in Loki something the other gods didn't: usefulness. Odin made him a blood brother, binding him to the Aesir not by trust, but by oath. Imagine the scene, the high god and the trickster cutting palms, their blood dripping into the earth, sealing a bond that would change the fate of worlds. It wasn't love, it wasn't friendship, it was calculation. Odin knew Loki could do what others couldn't: lies, tricks, bargains in the dark. At first, Loki seemed like an asset. He had a silver tongue, quick feet, and a knack for pulling solutions out of disaster. When Thor's wife Sif had her golden hair cut off in a cruel prank, who fixed it? Loki, bargaining with dwarves, tricking master craftsmen, bringing back treasures that arm the gods forever: Odin's spear Gungnir, Freya's ship Skidbladnir, and Thor's hammer Mjolnir. Yes, Loki caused the mess, but he also gave the gods weapons that defined their power. That's Loki in a nutshell, the problem and the solution, wrapped into one. But here's the catch: the gods laughed at him, even as they used what he brought them. They mocked his strangeness, his sharp tongue, his shifting forms. To them, Loki was never fully one of them. He was tolerated, not embraced, and that burns, doesn't it? To be needed but never loved, to be essential but never honoured. That's the wound Loki carried inside him. one that would fester until it consumed him and everyone around him. Picture the halls of Asgard, golden and echoing with songs of victory. Thor boasting about the hammer that Loki had indirectly gifted him. Odin sitting on his throne, wielding his spear forged by dwarves Loki tricked. Around them, the gods feasting, drinking, laughing. And at the edge of the table, Loki, smiling but not smiling, his laughter ringing just a little too sharp, his eyes watching, always calculating. He belonged, but not really. He was inside the walls, but still outside their hearts. This is the tension that makes Loki's story more than a bedtime story. It makes it a mirror, because everyone, at some point, knows what it feels like to be in the room but not truly welcomed. Everyone knows what it means to be underestimated, to wear the mask of humour while the heart simmers with something darker. Loki lived in that mask, and behind it, the Trickster waited. The shadows of Asgard stretched long across the golden halls, and in their corners, Loki's presence seemed sharper than the torches could soften. He was not like the others, and he knew it. His blood ran colder, his skin carried a hint of the Jotun frost, and his laughter always seemed edged with something the others couldn't quite name. For the Aesir, lineage mattered, strength of bloodlines, purity of origin. They wore it like armour. Loki was a fracture in that armour. His father, Farbauti, was a storm giant. His blows said to split trees and set forests aflame. His mother, Laufey, carried in her name the fragility of leaves trembling before winter winds. From them, Loki inherited contradiction, fire and fragility, storm and silence. Even as a child among giants, he was restless, eyes burning with a cunning that unsettled those around him. When he laughed, it was not the hearty sound of a boy, it was a blade testing its edge. Among the gods, he became something else. Odin saw in Loki what others dismissed. The one-eyed god understood that the worlds did not turn on brute strength alone. Wisdom could be trickery, victory could be deception. The bond he offered Loki was not born from trust, but from calculation. They cut their palms, mingled their blood, and called it brotherhood. Yet anyone watching closely would see the truth. Odin clasped Loki's hand, the way a hunter clasps a leash. To Loki, though, the oath was intoxicating. For the first time, he stood inside the circle of gods, not at its edges. He drank their mead, sat at their tables, and traded words with beings whose name shook mountains. But behind every nod, behind every smile, he sensed the weight of doubt pressing on him. When Thor laughed at a feast, it was often at Loki's expense. When Frigg whispered to Odin, Loki felt her eyes flick toward him, suspicious, measuring. This double life carved something into him. He was never only a Rotun, never fully a seer. That split inside him grew into a need to prove, to unsettle, to remind them that he was not theirs to define. And so he began to play his games. Not all cruel, not all kind. He gave gifts of wit, solutions no one else could find. But he also whispered provocations, set snares in their pride, pulled threads from the tapestry just to watch what might unravel. Still, the gods tolerated him, because he was useful. When a builder came to Asgard offering to raise impenetrable walls in exchange for the hand of Freya and the sun and the moon, it was Loki who saved them from a bargain too costly. His idea was simple, ridiculous, dangerous, distract the builder's mighty stallion so the work would fail. And when no one else could do it, Loki changed shape, became a mare, and lured the horse away. The gods jeered at his shamelessness, whispered about the shame of bearing Sleipnir, the eight-legged foal he birthed. Yet when Odin mounted that strange, perfect steed, he did not refuse it. He claimed it, proudly, as though Loki's disgrace was simply another tool in his arsenal. The lesson burned into Loki: their ridicule was never stronger than their hunger for what he could give them. This was how he survived, by being indispensable, by offering solutions no one else dared. But indispensability is not the same as belonging. At night, when feasts fell silent and only the wind hissed through Asgard's towers, Loki felt the hollowness in his chest. He wondered if Odin ever truly saw him, or only the tricks he carried. That hollowness festered. To fill it, Loki sought power in smaller victories, one jest at Thor's temper, one clever scheme that turned disaster into glory. Yet each victory tasted sour. The more he proved himself, the more they reminded him he was not one of them. And so the trickster grew sharper, his mind coiled with possibilities, every glance measured for weakness, every laugh hiding a plan. He told himself he didn't care. He told himself their contempt was fuel. But deep inside, in that place he would never show, Loki longed for something dangerous to be truly seen, truly accepted. And when that did not come, the longing twisted into something else. A god who feels unwanted can be mischievous, but a god who feels betrayed, that god can be catastrophic. Thor's laughter always filled a room before he did, bright as hammered bronze and twice as loud. That night it rang across the rafters while Sif sat near the hearth, her hair spilling like ripe fields over her shoulders. Loki lingered in the shadow of a carved pillar, heat rising under skin he wore like a costume. It wasn't envy of Sif, he didn't crave the sunlit ease she carried, but he couldn't ignore how effortlessly the gods adored what was golden. The laughing, the toasts, the way light itself chose favourites. Somewhere in that noise a thought clicked, sharp and small. If they worshipped the gold, he would take the gold, and see what their love was really made of. Before dawn the hall slept under the soft snore of champions. Loki moved like smoke. The great fire sighed to coals, the banners stirred just enough to whisper. The shears made almost no sound. When Sif stirred, reaching for the braids she always felt first each morning, the world tilted, her fingers touched bare scalp. The cry she gave cracked Thor's sleep like a shield split in battle. He came up swinging on reflex, then froze, horror outracing fury. Sif's eyes shone with water she would not let fall. Thor's big hands hovered, afraid to hurt her, afraid to touch the damage. Then his gaze lifted, hunting the joke that murdered laughter. He didn't need prophecy to name the culprit. Mischief had a flavour, and it tasted like Loki. They dragged him to the centre of the hall before the benches cooled. Odin's single eye was winter. Frigg's gaze, a knife returned to its sheath only for politeness' sake. Thor flexed his fists, eager to solve things the way thunder likes to solve them. Loki kept the smile that always irritated the righteous. He felt the room's weight settle on his shoulders and raised his empty hands. "I can fix it." Mockery rippled. Odin stopped it with a tilt of his head. If there was a fix, he would take it. If not, Thor would take something else, Loki's tongue, his pride, maybe his head. That was the bargain of belonging here, produce a miracle, or bleed for the attempt. The trickster dove into the earth. He knew the hidden veins that ran to the forges of the dark. In Nidavellir the air tasted of iron and promise. Sparks strobed like captive stars. Hammers argued with anvils until metal remembered its better self. He went first to the sons of Ivaldi, whispering a commission through a grin hair of gold for Sif. Not a wig, but a living harvest roots that would drink her scalp like rain, and grow with her as wheat grows with a field. Dwarves take insult as challenge and challenge as song. In that thunder, miracles condensed into shape. 3 gifts lay cooling on a stone the golden hair, glossy and warm as sunlight you could touch. Gungnir, a spear that wanted the heart of any aim and never forgave a miss, and Skidbladnir, a ship that filled with favourable wind the moment it tasted air, yet folded small as a silk square that could hide in a pocket. Loki stroked the hair and felt it purr along his fingers. Better than before. Not just mended elevated, but elevation invited escalation. If he brought back only restoration, they would forgive the prank and forget the hand that mended it. He wanted more than forgiveness. He wanted proof. So he went to Brokkr and his brother Eitri, masters whose pride was harder than their steel. Loki's smile sharpened. He wagered his head they could not craft treasures to match the sons of Ivaldi. Pride is a lever. He knew exactly where to plant it. Brokkr squinted. "Your head," he said slowly. "Not your neck." "My head," Loki agreed, the promise snapping shut like a trap. Eitri set the bellows. Brokkr worked the forge. Loki blurred his edges and became sabotage. As a fly he landed on Brokkr's eyelid, tasting brine and soot, bit deep. The dwarf did not flinch. He bit again, lower, where sweat pooled and irritation begged for a hand. Still the bellows pumped, steady as a heart. On the third work, when heat bent the air and the metal's breath turned wicked, Loki found the tender place at the fold of the wrist and drove his bite home. Brokkr jerked only a heartbeat, but sometimes a heartbeat is all fate needs. From the first mould came Gullinbursti, a boar whose bristles glowed like living sunrise, swift enough to run upon water or through night without fear. From the second came Draupnir, a ring heavy with lore. Every 9th night it birthed 8 more of itself, wealth multiplying like a rumour no vault could silence. From the third came a hammer, compact, irresistible, hungry for thunder. The handle, though, was shorter than intended. That tiny falter hardened into destiny. They named it Mjolnir. The air seemed to lean toward it. The room remembered storms. They marched to Asgard with their goods, forge heat haloing the gifts. Odin sat in judgment. The gods gathered like children promise sweets. Loki presented the sons of Ivaldi's wonders first. Sif's new hair took root the instant it touched her scalp, pouring down her back in a golden river. She closed her eyes as it warmed her skin, relief loosening her shoulders. Gungnir thrummed in Odin's hand like a caged tempest. Skidbladnir unfolded to impossible size, kissed by a wind that rose from nowhere, then folded to the softness and weight of a handkerchief. Approval rolled around the hall. Thor's jaw unclenched. Sif's smile returned, tentative and brave. Then Brokkr laid out his brother's works. Gullinbursti snorted daylight across the rushes. Draupnir settled heavy and holy on Odin's palm, and Mjolnir Thor lifted it, and thunder remembered its name. He swung once. The sound rolled through every rib in the room. Laughter rose, braided with fear. Odin named Mjolnir the finest of all treasures, not only for its power, but for what it promised: a wall you could carry in your fist, a certainty that giants would meet more than noise at the gate. By the letter of the wager, Loki's head belonged to Brokkr. The dwarf came to claim it without ceremony. Loki talked fast, the way he always did when the cliff edge crumbled under his heels. "You may have my head," he said, pivoting to lore like a dancer, "but you may not harm my neck." That wasn't the bargain. The court roared. Even Odin's mouth twitched, which for Odin is a laugh. Brokkr, cheated but bound by the rules he revered, sewed Loki's lips with wire cold as any winter he'd known. Loki endured it with dry eyes, smiling around the pain because smiling was the last weapon left to him. The stitches came out later, of course. Words are his blades. He would not stay disarmed. Thor tested his hammer the way a child tests a new world. It crushed stone into memory and flew back to his palm like a thought that refused to be lost. Loki watched, pulse ticking in his throat. Mjolnir would make Thor more than loud. It would make him necessary. And necessary people grow careless. He filed that away, a seed for storms. Sif raised her living hair, light spilling between her fingers. She thanked Loki softly. He shrugged the gratitude as if it were a cloak he couldn't wear in summer, but it settled inside him anyway, warm and small. It would have been easier if she had cursed him, easier if the gods had refused his gifts. Acceptance is the cruelest weapon. It invites you closer and reminds you that you will never stand at the fire's true center. The feast rose again. They drank to the hammer that would guard their walls, to the ship that could sail the sky, to the ring that made wealth breed like stories told twice. They drank too, to Sif restored. Loki drank with them, but he swallowed more than mead. He swallowed the fact that he had strengthened the very hands that would someday bind him. He had given them tools, and tools become towers, and towers become prisons for those who live in their shadows. Before dawn he stepped outside. The air had that thin edge it gets when night is almost over, fragile, blue, honest. Somewhere a golden boar tore a path through black pines. Somewhere in a vault a ring laboured to birth its copies. Somewhere in a quiet stall a hammer dreamed of battles. Loki tipped his head and listened. The world hummed with the things he had set in motion. He could almost convince himself the song was his. Almost. Birds began their busy gossip. A servant crossed the far end of the courtyard and glanced at him once, then away, as if his gaze might stain. Loki smiled into the daylight. The game was still on. He would keep playing it until the board burned, and if they insisted on worshipping what was golden, he would show them how easily gold melts when the right fire finds it. The walls of Asgard rose like pale cliffs against the northern sky, too smooth and too high to belong to mortal hands. Yet they were incomplete, gaps yawning like wounds, and every god knew giants watched those openings. The bargain had seemed clever when it was struck. A builder appeared. promising fortifications so strong not even Jotun armies could break them, walls that would make Asgard unassailable. His price was staggering the sun, the moon, and Freya herself. No sane god would have agreed, but Loki's tongue greased the decision. He suggested terms that seemed impossible. The builder must finish in one season, and without help. Odin's one eye narrowed. The others hesitated, but Loki's reasoning sparkled with its usual charm. If the builder failed, the gods gained walls for nothing. If he succeeded, which Loki said he wouldn't, they could deal with it then. The council nodded, persuaded by his confidence, but the builder was cleverer than they guessed. He revealed a stallion, Svadilfari, whose strength was unmatched. By day the giant placed stone upon stone, but by night Svadilfari dragged whole mountains to the site. The wall rose too quickly, and each dawn the gods saw fewer gaps. Anxiety thickened like frost in spring. Thor muttered of broken oaths and shattered skulls. Freya's face hardened in dread, and Odin's silence grew heavier. When it became clear the bargain might be lost, the gods turned their rage on Loki. He had urged them into this risk, and now they demanded he fix it. His smirk, practiced and sharp, faltered beneath their stares. There are moments when even the trickster feels the weight of his own lies. Still, he bowed his head, because what else could he do without a miracle? Freya would be given to a stranger, and the heavens themselves bartered away. So he studied the stallion, massive, tireless, focused. Svadilfari was the heart of the builder's progress. Without him, the work would slow, perhaps stop altogether. Loki knew what must be done, though shame curdled his stomach. Tricks often left stains. He waited until dusk, when shadows gathered thick around the stones. Then he shifted, bones rearranging, voice vanishing into a whinny. Where Loki had stood, there was now a mare, sleek and bright-eyed, with a mane like flowing smoke. The stallion caught her scent and broke from his harness, eyes rolling white, hooves tearing furrows in the earth. The builder shouted, cursed, and chased, but lust is stronger than labour. The stallion thundered into the woods after the mare. For 3 nights and days the chase raged, hooves splintering roots, branches cracking overhead, until the mare led him so far and so long that the wall lay silent, stones half placed, the work undone. When at last the stallion returned, he was staggering and exhausted, no longer fit to haul granite. The season ended, the wall unfinished, the bargain broken. Thor swung his hammer, and the builder's skull shattered into dust. The gods cheered, feasting in triumph, their walls strong enough to last ages. But Loki did not join the laughter. He carried something the others could not see. In time, he gave birth to Sleipnir, a foal unlike any other 8-legged, grey as storm clouds, swift as thought itself. Odin claimed him immediately, riding the strange beast as if it had always been meant for him. The All-Father praised the horse's speed, the grace with which it galloped across earth, sea, and sky. To Odin it was a gift. To Loki it was a scar. Every time Sleipnir's hooves struck the ground, Loki remembered the humiliation etched into his body, the desperate chase through dark forests, the smirks of gods who applauded the outcome but never the sacrifice. He had given them a wonder, and in return he kept the whispers of disgrace. They would never let him forget the mare, never let him forget that, even in his triumphs. His role was to crawl lower than anyone else dared. That bitterness hardened something inside him. The gods saw only a horse. Loki saw the reminder that he would always be useful, but never honoured. The walls of Asgard stood tall, and within them he carried the seed of betrayal, waiting for the right season to grow. Winter had begun to creep early that year, a thin frost over the meadows and a chill in the halls of Asgard that no fire quite banished. The gods grew restless, sensing something amiss, but no one could name it. They only knew the songs felt slower on their tongues, their limbs heavy, their skin sagging in ways unfamiliar. It was as though time itself had turned its face against them. Idun was the quiet centre of their youth. She carried her casket of golden apples wherever she went, and with them the promise of renewal. One bite, and wrinkles fled, another, and bones straightened, vigour seeping back into tired veins. The gods guarded her presence the way mortals guard fire. Without her, their glory would dim, their strength decay, their eternity reveal itself as illusion. Loki saw the change first, or perhaps he simply admitted it sooner. Thor's knuckles ached longer after battles. Freya dabbed at her eyes with powders to hide shadows not made by sorrow. Even Odin sat his throne more often, the weight of the spear dragging on his arm. Loki smiled, not with joy, but with recognition the immortals feared mortality, and fear makes fools of anyone. It was then that Thiassi came, a giant with hunger deeper than mountains. He caught Loki wandering at the edges of the world, restless as always. In the shape of an eagle, Thiassi swooped and lifted him high above the forests, claws digging until blood slicked Loki's arms. He dangled there, cursing, bargaining, until the giant's wings slowed. Thiassi's voice rumbled like stones grinding. He demanded a prize greater than gold, greater than silver. He wanted Idun and her apples. Pain sharpens wit. Loki agreed. When they landed, he went straight to Idun with a tale of strange fruit hidden in the woods, sweeter than anything in her orchard. Curiosity was her nature. She followed, clutching her casket to her chest. The moment she crossed the tree line, Thiassi seized her and carried her into the frozen reaches of his home. The forest swallowed the echo of her cries. Days passed. The gods weakened, their hair paling, their voices cracking. Even Thor could barely lift his hammer. His veins felt full of sand. Odin's eye dimmed, his vision blurring into memory. Panic roared through the halls, but panic found its target. Loki. It was always him. They seized him by the throat, demanded answers, demanded repair. He felt Thor's trembling hand at his collar and almost laughed. Thor could barely strangle him anymore. Still, survival was his craft. Loki promised to set things right if they gave him Freya's falcon cloak, a relic that let the wearer fly faster than any bird. They agreed, for they had no choice. Cloaked in feathers, Loki leapt into the wind, his body streaming into the sky, a shadow darting over peaks and valleys until he found Thiassi's hall. Inside, Idun sat small and pale, apples clutched in her lap. Loki swooped down, wrapped her in his talons, and carried her away. Her scream tore through the air, waking Thiassi. The giant launched skyward in eagle form, beating the wind into a storm behind him. Loki strained, wings tearing against the gale, feathers burning with speed. As they neared Asgard, the gods had prepared. They piled wood along the walls, set torches ablaze, and when Loki shot through the gates with Idun, they lit the pyres. Flames leapt into the sky, and Thiassi, blinded by smoke and heat, fell into the firestorm. His wings crumpled, his body struck the earth with a sound that ended in silence. The gods rushed to Idun, desperate hands reaching for her apples, their breaths ragged with need. With each bite, colour returned, eyes brightened, spines straightened. Laughter spilled again through the halls, relief drunk as wine. Loki stood among them, feathers singed, skin scorched, smiling thinly as if it were all part of his plan. But not everyone celebrated. Skadi, Thiassi's daughter, came down from the mountains, her boots crunching frost on Asgard's stone. She carried sorrow in one hand and vengeance in the other. The gods tried appeasement, they offered her a place among them. Laughter from Loki's lips to soften grief, and even Odin's solemn oath to honour her father's memory in the stars. Skadi accepted, but her eyes never left Loki. She knew whose trick had lured her father to his death. The hall glittered with youth restored, but Loki walked away from the firelight, his smile flickering like smoke. He had saved them again. Yes, but every salvation he offered carved him deeper into a corner. They would never forget that the sickness had started with him, nor that the cure bore his fingerprints. And as the night deepened, Loki knew that one day, no fire would be bright enough to burn away the shadow he had become. The mountains of Jotunheim brooded under a sky torn by wind, jagged peaks rising like broken teeth. Loki walked there often, slipping away from Asgard when the laughter grew too sharp, when the stairs pressed too heavy. The gods could never truly see him, here at least. The stones asked no questions. It was in those valleys of ice and shadow that he found her Angerboda, the bringer of grief. Her hair was dark as a cave where no torch dares burn, her gaze steady, unflinching. She did not flinch at him either, not at his shifting words, not at the fox smile he carried everywhere like armour. Angerboda looked through it and found the man underneath, the one who ached to be more than useful. In her hut at the edge of the ironwood forest, Loki laid down his masks. He could not do that in Odin's hall. Their union was not gentle, nor was it tender. It was fire meeting frost, sparks hissing against snow, yet in that violence of opposites, something rooted. From Angerboda's body and Loki's restless spirit came children that were less like babes and more like prophecies dressed in flesh. The first was a wolf, jaws too large for its newborn head, eyes like coals waiting for wind. They named him Fenrir. He grew faster than any cub should, each sunrise stretching him larger until even the bravest hunters would not stand in his shadow. When he opened his mouth, the sound was not a whimper but thunder rolling across stone. The second was Jörmungandr, a serpent so long it tangled upon itself, coils glistening with venom. Loki held it once, briefly, feeling the slick strength sliding across his arms until it twisted free and slithered toward the sea, as if drawn by fate to the waves that would cradle it until the end of days. The third was Hel, neither wholly alive nor entirely dead. One half of her body glowed with the flush of a child, the other half sagged pale and blue, as if the grave had already claimed her, yet her eyes, both living and dead, were calm. She looked at her father without fear, without worship, as though she already knew she belonged to no one. When the gods learned of these children, terror spread faster than wildfire. Odin's ravens whispered of destiny, of chains snapping, of a wolf swallowing the sun and a serpent choking the sky. Odin did not wait. He summoned the gods, and together they decided. The children would not grow free. Each one must be cast away before their strength outgrew the walls of Asgard. Thor gripped his hammer, muttering of slaughter, but Odin chose banishment. He took the serpent in his one good hand, hurled it across the sky, and watched it vanish into the sea's black throat. There Jörmungandr sank until its coils encircled Midgard entirely, tail locked in its own jaws, waiting. Heli sent to the underworld, Niflheim, gifting her dominion over the dead, though all knew it was exile disguised as honour. She built her hall there, Eljudnir, cold and vast, where the unglorious dead gathered under her half-shadowed gaze. Only Fenrir remained in Asgard, for Odin thought to raise him near, to keep watch. At first the gods approached the wolf cautiously, feeding him scraps, speaking soft words. He played with Tyr, the only one brave enough to place a hand on his muzzle. But with each season he grew, paws like shields, breath hot enough to steam rivers. The laughter around him turned to silence, then whispers, then dread. Loki watched all this, anger knotting tight inside him. His children had been judged before they had even drawn breath. He saw Odin's eye gleam with suspicion, Thor's lip curl in disdain, Frigg's whisper warning of omens. Yet in Jotunheim, when he returned to Angerboda, he felt a strange pride. Their offspring carried the shape of doom. Yes, but they were his blood, his truth. For once, he had made something not for the gods but against them. And in the quiet of Angerboda's hut, with the wind clawing at the roof and the wolf pup's growl already echoing like thunder, Loki realized a truth more dangerous than any trick he had ever played. Sometimes the greatest mischief is not in words or pranks or wagers, but in creation itself. His laughter that night was low, sharp, and unending. It was the sound of a seed already splitting the earth. The wolf's paws thundered against the courtyard stones, each step heavier than the last. Fenrir no longer looked like a beast meant to be stroked behind the ears. He looked like a shadow given hunger. His shoulders rose higher than men's heads. His teeth gleamed like white axes. The Aesir whispered that every day he ate more than herds could provide, and every night he stared at the moon as if he meant to bite it down from the sky. Odin's council gathered in tense silence. The gods argued. Thor slammed his fist, demanding the wolf be slain. Frigg warned that spilling his blood would curse them all. Tyr alone stepped forward with calm eyes. He had fed Fenrir, had stroked the beast's head, had taught him to trust a hand without flinching. If he must be bound, Tyr said, let it be by oath, not slaughter. So they forged chains. The first was heavy with iron, clanking like 100 anvils. They wrapped it around Fenrir, challenging him to test his strength. With a growl that rattled every shield on the wall, the wolf flexed once, twice, and the links burst apart like cobwebs. The gods muttered, faces pale. The second chain they made thicker, enchanted with fire and ice, wound with runes no mortal tongue could read. They bound Fenrir again, voices taunting, promising glory if he broke free. He sank his claws into the earth, pulled, and with a roar like mountains collapsing, he shattered the fetters. The pieces scattered across the field like broken promises. Desperation drove them deeper. They sent for the dwarves, those silent masters beneath the earth, from cat's footsteps, woman's beard, mountain roots, bird's spit, and fish's breath things that could not exist they wove Gleipnir, a ribbon soft as silk, smooth as a lover's hair, yet strong enough to choke eternity. When they brought it to Fenrir, suspicion burned in his eyes. The wolf lifted his head, jaws glistening. "This ribbon is trickery," he said, voice deep as thunder. "If you mean to bind me, one of you must place a hand in my mouth, a pledge of good faith. Otherwise, I will not play your game." No one moved, not Thor, not Odin, not Freya with all her bright courage. Only Tyr stepped forward, his jaw clenched, but his voice did not waver. "I will keep faith," he said, and he placed his right hand in Fenrir's mouth. The gods wrapped Gleipnir around the wolf. He strained, but the ribbon did not break. He thrashed, dug trenches into the earth, howled until the mountains shook, but the ribbon only tightened, whispering against his fur like fate itself. When he realized the truth, rage filled his eyes. With one snap, he sheared through Tyr's hand. Blood sprayed across the stones, and the god staggered back, silent, his face carved with pain but not regret. Fenrir roared, struggling against the ribbon, but it held fast. The gods drove a sword into his jaws, forcing them apart so he could not bite again. His howls rolled through the realms, carrying terror to every ear that heard them. The gods celebrated their victory, but it was a hollow cheer. Tyr's blood stained the ground, proof that peace had been bought with betrayal. Odin's face was grim, for he knew what bound Fenrir was not just a ribbon, but prophecy itself. The wolf would wait, coiled with fury, until the day the bonds finally snapped. And when that day came, no wall of Asgard would be high enough, no spear sharp enough, no hammer heavy enough to stop him. Loki stood apart, watching. He saw his son's eyes blazing with hatred, saw the gods turn away from Tyr's wound as if it were nothing but the cost of doing business. And he understood in that moment that their fear was not of monsters, it was of anything they could not control. That fear would one day devour them all, and Fenrir's howl was only the beginning. Balder dreamed of darkness, night after night. He woke with his skin cold, his breath shallow, visions clinging to him like cobwebs. He spoke of a shadow rising, of his own body pale upon a pyre, of weeping that reached across the 9 realms. The dream spread through Asgard like smoke, and even the most confident gods felt a chill they could not shake. Frigg, his mother, moved to protect him. She travelled the worlds, her voice steady as she spoke to stone and fire, to iron and sickness, to every beast of land and sea. Each swore an oath never to harm Balder. Weapons dulled at his presence. Sickness slunk away. Even the elements bent themselves in promise. The court rejoiced, relief bubbling into laughter. Their beloved Balder was untouchable. The gods began to treat it as sport, hurling spears, axes, and stones at him in the hall, each weapon bouncing harmlessly away. Their games rang with cheers. Balder smiled, though a shadow still lingered in his eyes. Yet there was one thing Frigg overlooked: the mistletoe, small and harmless, hanging quiet in the branches of the winter woods. It seemed too insignificant for oaths, too fragile to matter, and so no vow was taken from it. Loki learned of this absence, his curiosity sharpened by the sound of laughter echoing down Asgard's halls. He walked among the games, watching gods fling weapons with delight while Balder stood serene in the storm of steel. The trickster's smile stretched thin. To Loki, it was not joy he heard, but arrogance, the kind of arrogance that stinks of inevitability. He found Herder, Balder's blind brother, sitting apart, silent in his darkness. Loki leaned close, voice smooth, almost kind. "Why do you not join the game?" Why let them mock your sight when your hand could be as sure as theirs? Herder's sightless face lifted. Uncertain, Loki pressed a sprig into his hand, shaped like a dart, light as a whisper. Here is your weapon. Let me guide your throw. The hall roared with another wave of laughter as Herder rose. Guided by Loki's hand, he cast the dart of mistletoe. It struck, and this time there was no bounce, no harmless deflection. The sprig pierced Baldur's heart. He staggered once, his smile fading, and then he fell silent onto the stone. The hall froze. Weapons slipped from hands. Laughter died into a vacuum of horror. Sif pressed her palms to her mouth. Odin's single eye dimmed. Thor's hammer shook in his grasp as if it too mourned. Baldur lay still, light gone from his face. The most beloved of the gods was dead, and silence crashed heavier than any blow. Nanna, Baldur's wife, collapsed beside him. Her heart broke in the shadow of his stillness, and before the pyre was built, she too was gone, consumed by grief. The gods built Hringhorni, Baldur's ship, the largest ever made, to carry him to the sea. But the ship would not move until the giantess Hyrrokin arrived, riding a wolf, her touch violent enough to shove the vessel into the waves. Fire caught the wood, smoke rose thick, and flames devoured the god who was supposed to be untouchable. Hermodr, swiftest of Odin's sons, rode Sleipnir into the dark. He reached Hel's cold hall and begged for Baldur's release. Hel, half beautiful and half corpse, listened. She offered a condition: if every creature wept for Baldur, he would be returned. If even one refused, he would remain. The gods sent word through all the realms, and everything wept: trees dripping resin, stones sweating dew, beasts keening in the forests. Everything but one. In a cave, a giantess named Thuk sat unmoved, her eyes cold as frost. She refused to weep, saying, "Let Hel hold what she has." Some whispered it was Loki in disguise, laughing in the shadows. Whatever the truth, the outcome was fixed. Baldur would not return. The gods came back to Asgard hollow, their hearts cut with grief and fury. The laughter that once shook the halls had curdled into silence, the kind of silence that waits for vengeance. And in that silence, Loki's smile sharpened, knowing he had touched the untouchable, and the game would never be the same again. Grief changed how sound moved through Asgard. Voices lowered, footsteps softened. Even the wind across the courtyard seemed to hesitate, as if afraid to be caught laughing. Where there had been games, there were offerings, where jokes barged in. Careful silence sat like a guest no one could ask to leave. Yet nothing is truly silent. Rumour moved under eaves and along colonnades, naming one figure first with doubt, then with certainty: Loki. He kept to the edges, not cowering but watching, the way a fox waits at the tree line, measuring distance and timing. He had pressed a nerve the gods did not know they had. They had sworn to live above consequence, and now consequence sat at their table. Thor stalked like a storm in boots. Frigg's face carried the look of a candle guttering in its own wax. Odin said little, and the little he said felt like a verdict already formed. They wanted a culprit, a confession, an object to nail their grief to. The blind brother could not serve as villain. Everyone knew who had guided his hand, yet Loki did not run. Pride told him not to give them the pleasure. Habit told him he was untouchable because he had delivered them too many indispensable things. It is a common delusion believing usefulness will protect you from people who fear it. A council gathered, colder than steel. Names were not spoken, but charges were. A life had been taken inside the safety of the hall. Oaths had been bent into weapons. Hel had set her price, and the worlds had wept, and still it was not enough. If one creature will not shed a tear, Odin said, voice flat, we must turn toward the one who taught the world to keep its cheeks dry. Eyes drifted to the empty chair where Loki sometimes lounged with his lazy smile. He chose not to appear. That was his answer, a refusal shaped like absence. Messengers returned with nothing but stories: a shadow on a roofline, a laughing voice in a corridor already searched, wet footprints that vanished at a drain. He did not flee the city so much as he fled their narrative, slipping between stories like a knife between ribs. At the river, a fisherman swore he saw a man studying currents as if memorizing where they broke. As mistrust spread, so did piety. Offerings erupted like weeds mead left for Balder at doorways, white flowers tucked into spear racks, a thin braid of Sif's new hair tied to a beam. The gods wanted to be seen grieving properly. They wanted the world to know they deserved their beloved back, but grief is a mirror. What they wanted most was control restored. The clock wound back to the hour before a harmless sprig became a blade. Freya asked for patience and failed. Heimdall asked for vigilance and was obeyed. Watchers lined the walls, eyes turned outward for threats and inward for treachery. Tyr kept his sleeve pinned neatly over the absence of his hand and said nothing, because he alone understood the flaw in the new order. Peace built on coercion is not peace, it is delay. He stood in the yard listening to youths practice and thought about promises shaped like ribbons. When night came hard, Aegir sent word of a feast. The sea giant rarely hosted, and when he did, the mead did not run out and the music swallowed hours whole. Odin agreed to attend. He wanted the gods seen strong, standing together even if grief stood with them. Nets glazed with salt hung from rafters. Lanterns tossed warm light over roasted fish and thick bread. Everyone came armed, not with steel, but with certainty sharpened into suspicion. Loki watched from the slope above the bay, cloak dark against darker pines. He considered staying away, then went because some collisions cannot be avoided. They can only be steered. He entered late, posture loose as if built entirely of shrugs. Conversation stalled and then clattered on louder than before. He took a stool against the wall where draughts gathered, lifted a cup, and said nothing. The not-saying said plenty. Aegir's mead flowed, and with it a brittle camaraderie. A skald began a poem about Balder's gentleness, and the hall bowed its head. Loki watched the bowing with something like hunger and something like contempt. He loved the sound of truth. He hated the way people used it to dress their preferred lies. He felt words building in his throat like weather. He swallowed, and at last he stopped swallowing. He stood. Benches creaked. "You want someone to blame," he said quietly. "Then blame yourselves and your game. You taught yourselves to throw steel at a friend for sport and laugh when the steel failed. You turned oaths into theatre." Thor tensed. Sif's hand found his forearm. Frigg went white as frost. "Your love made him untouchable," Loki said. "Your love killed him. I only pointed." The last word landed like a nail. The eruption came. Odin's voice cut through the din. Heimdall took a single small step that meant a door would close soon. Accusations broke loose like sparks looking for hay. Loki did not bother to dodge. He named hypocrisies the way a blacksmith names tools. He reminded them that Odin fed the raven of war with his own hand, that Thor's mercy arrived only after thunder had its say, that truth told in whispers still wounds. By the time the first cup shattered, the feast had already become a court. Aegir's servants backed toward the kitchen, eyes wide. Outside, the tide lifted the moored ships as if the sea itself wanted to lean closer. Loki reached to his belt and drew out a weave. No one had seen a mesh of lines so fine it held a pattern in the air. He let the lantern light run across the net. The room stilled, unable to decide if it was sorcery or a toy. "This is how you catch what slips your fingers," he said. "You don't chase the fish. You learn the water. You set the shape, and then you let need swim into it." He turned the net so its edges glittered and then folded it small. Heimdall's eyes narrowed. Odin hid his interest poorly. Some knowledge is louder than a shout. Loki tucked the net away, and the hall exhaled without meaning to. He left before they could choose between laughter and shackles. He moved quick along the beach, both hunted and volunteer. Behind him voices crashed like surf. Before him, the black bay gathered the sky's pinpricks and kept them. He waded in. The cold took his breath and gave it back cut and clear. The net unfurled from his hands like a thought he had been thinking for years. He let it sink, then pulled. Silver bodies flashed and stilled. By morning the story had already changed. Some said he threatened the court. Some said he confessed. Some swore they saw tears on his face. Others swore they saw only teeth. The only detail everyone agreed on was the net, its shape, its glimmer, the way it seemed designed for more than fish. Heimdall ordered copies. Odin doubled the lookouts. Frigg lit another candle. Thor slept in his boots. Loki did not sleep. In a tide-polished cave he worked, learning how lines knot to become stronger than their thread, how one pattern can hide another, how a tool meant for dinner might catch rumour. Secret. Man. He hummed to keep the dark from pressing too close. When dawn finally stitched pale thread across the water, he rolled the net and tucked it into a crack the colour of his doubt. The sea kept its counsel. The hall kept its anger simmering beneath smiles tonight. He did not yet know the shape of the end. He only knew grief had turned the air to glass, and every movement might crack it. Somewhere, inland, a mother counted beads and waited for a door that would not open. Beyond the horizon, a serpent shifted in its sleep and tightened around the world by the width of a dream. On the practice field, Tyr bowed before and after teaching a boy, because honour is sometimes all you have when the ribbon tightens. The sea still murmured of that night when Loki unveiled the net, but Asgard pretended it had moved on, pretended that was the word. The gods filled their days with hunts and judgments, feasts and marriages, trying to drown grief in routine. But the silence around Baldur's death and the suspicion curling behind every smile never left the air. And silence like that always needs a crack to burst through. It came at another feast, this one in Aegir's hall by the sea, where the mead was endless and the torches smoked until the rafters were black. Aegir's daughters poured drink with patient hands. The music swelled, and for a few hours the gods forgot to look over their shoulders. Even Thor laughed without the edge in his throat. Loki watched from the benches, the old hunger gnawing. Every toast to Baldur tasted to him like a lie. Every song about glory felt like theatre, performed for actors who had already forgotten their lines. He stood suddenly, voice cutting through the music. "You drink to your strength," he said, "but your strength is brittle. You sing of your honour, but your honour is riddled with cracks." The room stilled, then bristled. Odin's one eye narrowed. Frigg's hand gripped her cup until her knuckles went white. Thor set Mjolnir on the table like punctuation. Loki began with Bragi, the poet, mocking his cowardice. Then he turned on Idun, accusing her of lying beneath her golden innocence. One by one, he carved at them. He told Freya she had shared her bed with her brother Freya, told Njord his time among the Vanir left him reeking of salt and shame, told Tyr he was a fool with one hand and half a purpose. He called Odin less a king than a collector of secrets too heavy to carry, a god who bartered his eye and still saw nothing clearly. He even sneered at Thor, saying the hammer did not make him brave, only predictable. The insults landed like stones in water, ripples spreading outward. Some gods shouted back, voices raised, but Loki's words cut sharper than their retorts. They weren't wild taunts. They were truths dressed as jests. The kind of truths everyone already knew but refused to speak aloud. That was what made them sting. Freya's face flushed, her voice rising in fury, but Odin lifted a hand, silencing her. He knew too well the power of words in open court. If they answered every charge, they admitted too much. Still, the silence after Loki's barbs was worse than shouting. It meant his words had found purchase. At last, Sif tried to soften the moment, asking for calm, for the feast to return to its purpose. Loki laughed, a sound sharp as broken glass. "Calm. You want calm from me when you wear your golden hair like forgiveness. But we all know whose scissors gave you that gift." Her face paled, and Thor rose, hammer in hand. The hall trembled with the sudden weight of violence waiting to break. Before Thor could swing, Loki's smile faltered, just for an instant. He saw what he had done the way every eye in the room burned with either hatred or hurt. There was no going back now. He had said aloud the truths no one forgives, the ones that fracture a family beyond repair. That was the moment the bond with the gods, already frayed, finally snapped. He slipped from the hall as Thor lunged, faster than rage could follow. Outside, the sea hissed against the rocks, and the sky leaned heavy with storm. Behind him, the laughter of the gods had curdled forever. Ahead of him lay only exile. He walked into the night knowing he had set something loose that could not be chained again. Not with ribbon, not with iron, not with silence. The night took him in like a door closing softly. Loki followed the cliff path until torches were embers behind him, and the surf below stitched a white hem on black water. Exile tasted clean salt, pine, iron. He kept moving until the land narrowed into a ravine where a river fell in sheets of glass. Behind the waterfall, a hollow waited a cave with walls slick as fish skin and a floor cold enough to wake pain. He slept in bursts and dreamed in knives. By morning he was working, because work keeps a mind from eating itself. He gathered flax and horsehair, spun sinew between his fingers, and knotted what he had only hinted at in Aegir's hall, discovering how angles become patience and patience becomes a trap. The net grew under his hands, loops that yielded and then refused, cords that looked like nothing and argued like law when drawn tight. It pleased him with the quiet pride of a craftsman whose tool does exactly what it promises. Hunters read tracks, liars read breath, fishermen read water. Loki read all three. He tested the mesh in the river's green slide, watched it belly and sing, watched the current try to keep its secrets and fail. He felt a peace he'd never permit himself in any hall. He knew they would come. The insult feast had lit every fuse. Heimdall's gaze would rake the coasts. Odin's thoughts would sit where sea met stone. Thor would follow impatience like a hound follows blood. Loki made a fire anyway, because a man should be warm when he decides how he will be caught. At noon, ravens stitched black letters across the sky. He burned the first net, not out of regret discipline. If they found the pattern, they would use it. He watched the cords crisp and curl, the knots charter beads, then slept again with a second coil hidden deep. They arrived at dusk boots on wet rock, the dull ring of iron against cliff. Odin's shadow filled the ravine's mouth, a silhouette crowned by gulls. Thor stood beside him, hammer quiet, tear a little back, sleeve pinned neat, Freya and Freya like cold statues, Heimdall motionless, listening to light. No one spoke his name. Names are for family. Odin stooped, sifted ash with 2 fingers, lifted it to the wind, and watched how it left him. He made a net. He said. Thor's mouth hardened. The others shifted. Heimdall knelt and sketched loops in damp gravel, finishing the pattern Loki had once turned in a lantern glow. "We make one," Odin said. "We drag the river." While they braided rope from ship lines and stubbornness, Loki slid his second net into the pool behind the fall and sank into the green where sound goes to die. When the first sweep came, he felt it like a fence easing across his back. He wriggled free and smiled. Private. The second pass came lower, cleverer. He twisted through a vein where rock narrowed to a fist. The third pass came tight as a throat. Choice sharpened. He let his body answer the water. He shortened and narrowed. Scales took the place of skin. The world blurred into taste and pressure. A salmon flashed where a man had been. He lay still while the mesh brushed his flank, then bolted toward white water, hugging bottom where stones wear moss like old men wear beards. Outside, Thor waded to his thighs, planting his feet the way trees do. "He's in here," he said, and the river agreed against his shins. Heimdall tilted the net. Odin raised 2 fingers. Tyr eased old syllables through his teeth, asking the current to forgive this trespass. The mesh tightened. It missed. It tightened again. Loki burst from a pocket and streaked silver, arrow quick, toward the only gap left, a narrow lane beside a boulder the size of a whale's skull. Thor was waiting. He didn't swing. He dipped. 2 hands like doors caught the salmon in mid-leap. The fish bucked, whipping water into the giant's beard. Loki twisted, tendons screaming inside their new architecture, tail beating like a drum. Thor squeezed harder. Slippery. He grunted as if the river had decided to argue. Loki slipped once more, almost free. Thor's fingers found purchase in the soft notch above the tail where flesh narrows to hinge. He clamped, and the salmon went still but shivered. A pulse of fury locked in muscle. They dragged him to shore and let the form collapse. Loki coughed up river and air in a curse that tasted of iron. Odin looked at him with the expression a carpenter gives a broken tool regret without affection. "Enough," the All-Father said. "The game is over. Games end when someone stops playing," Loki said, smiling through water and exhaustion. "You kept playing." Thor lifted him by the collarbone. "You kept talking." Before they hauled him up the bank, a figure stepped from the trees, quiet as snowfall, the last person he expected and the only one he had hoped for. Sigurd's cloak was plain, her hair pinned back, her eyes without spectacle. She looked at the gods, and then at Loki, and the 2 looks were not the same. She did not ask what he had done. She asked where he hurt and what he needed that no one had ever given him. Odin's mouth thinned. "This path ends one way," he said. "Stand aside." Sigyn did not. She walked to Loki and set her palm against his cheek. The touch shocked him more than the net had. He tried to make a joke. Nothing witty arrived. She spoke low, for him alone. "Where you go, I go," she said. "Where you break, I hold." Freya's brows lifted. Tyr looked away. Heimdall watched a future lengthen and tighten like a rope drying in sun. Thor exhaled through his nose, a sound like a gate giving up. Even Odin hesitated long enough to be human. Then he nodded once, and the world moved again. They bound Loki's wrists, not roughly, with craftsmanship that carried no malice because it did not need any. As they led him from the ravine, the river shouldered back into itself, indifferent. The fire pit cooled toward black. They paused on the ridge when the wind rose, because the wind always has something to say. Odin listened and almost smiled. "You invented a way to catch what can't be held," he said. "That is your greatness and your crime." Loki shrugged as best he could. "You taught me it's better to hold a thing than to deserve it." They walked until the night thinned. He did not beg. He did not spit. He saved his breath for the pain he could feel circling like wolves below the tree line of morning. Sigyn walked beside him without speaking, every step a small oath to an audience of one. He wondered if she understood what that loyalty would cost. He wondered if love was a bowl or a blade. He wondered which he needed more. At the forest's edge they stopped. Odin gestured, and the searchers peeled away to scout for a place stone quiet enough to hold the next act. In the lull, Loki turned to Sigyn. "You can leave," he said. "One day I won't even be able to tell you to." She shook her head. "You don't have to tell me anything," she said. "You have to endure." He wanted to ask why. He didn't. Some answers only shatter when said aloud. He looked past her to where the sky was paling and felt a clarity that hurt. He had always believed laughter would save him by making him useful, by making him necessary, by making him untouchable. He saw now that usefulness is only another leash, necessity another lie, and untouchable a word the powerful use when they think they'll never have to learn your name. He would learn something else instead, what breaks and what doesn't. Dawn crawled over the hills, grey first, then blue, then a gold that made everything look honest. The gods returned with news of a cave where the earth keeps secrets, and the roof will not fall. Thor tugged the rope once, not cruelly, to say move. Loki moved. Sigyn moved with him. The ravens followed at a distance. The river went on saying what rivers always say, nothing stays. Everything does. They brought him to a cave where the ceiling dripped in slow intervals, each drop loud as a drum in the silence. The air smelled of stone and earth older than promises. Loki stood in the centre, wrists bound, his smirk long gone but not his defiance. The gods surrounded him like judges who already knew the verdict. Odin didn't speak much. He rarely needed to when silence did the work. Thor's grip on Mjolnir tightened, but he did not strike. The punishment had been decided. They dragged forth Loki's sons, Vali and Narfi. Vali was transformed into a wolf by the god's own sorcery, his eyes wild, teeth dripping foam. He turned on his brother before anyone could stop it, tearing him apart in a frenzy of blood. The scream carved through the cave and echoed into the roots of the mountain. When it was over, the gods took Narfi's entrails, slick and red, and bound Loki to 3 stones set deep in the earth. The guts hardened into iron beneath their hands. A mockery of nature turned into shackles. Above his head they hung a serpent, its jaws dripping venom. Each drop sizzled when it struck the rock, burning pits into the stone. The gods left then, their task complete, their vengeance drawn neat and final. Only Sigyn remained. She stepped forward with a bowl in her hands, plain clay, no ornament. She held it beneath the serpent's fangs, catching the poison before it could strike her husband's face. Loki stared at her, disbelief flickering through his pain. She did not speak. She only caught and held and caught again. But bowls fill. When hers grew heavy, she had to turn and empty it. In those moments the venom fell freely, spattering Loki's skin. Each drop was fire. Each burn a scream ripped raw from his chest. He writhed against the bonds. The cave shuddered. The mountain itself groaned. Mortals far above felt the tremors and called them earthquakes, never knowing they were hearing the agony of a god chained beneath their feet. Between the drops, Loki lay gasping, his body quaking, but his eyes still bright. Sigyn returned each time, arms trembling from the weight, her face pale but unyielding. She caught what she could, over and over, knowing the task would never end. Her silence was fiercer than any battle cry. It was not forgiveness she offered, nor agreement, it was endurance. And endurance, she showed, can be stronger than wrath. Loki's mind wandered in the dark. He remembered Sleipnir's birth, Sif's golden hair, the taste of mead at Aegir's feast, the laughter that always turned sharp at his expense. He thought of Fenrir, jaws clamped in prophecy, Jörmungandr, coiled around the world in silence, Hel, seated on her throne in half-shadow, his children, like him, cast away, yet waiting. The venom burned, but so did the thought that one day bonds would snap, jaws would open, seas would break, and the earth would shake, not from pain, but from release. And still Sigyn stayed, catching drop after drop, her loyalty a blade the gods had not expected. If Loki was the architect of chaos, she became the architect of endurance, her quiet defiance carving space for him to breathe when fate tried to choke him. He screamed, he laughed bitterly, he cursed every name he knew, but she remained. In that cave of stone and venom, two truths coexisted, torment without end, and love without surrender. Snow began to forget how to stop. What should have been a season became a sentence. Winds crossed the world with knives in their mouths. The first winter was cruel, the second hungrier, the third arrived without asking and refused to leave. It blew out hearths, muffled prayers, and taught people to sleep with boots on. The gods called it Fimbulwinter. Mortals simply called it weather, because naming a catastrophe does not warm a hand. Wolves ran where villages had been, smoke from signal fires flattened on ice. Grain rotted in barns. Mothers told doubtful stories about a son that would return any day now. Days forgot to be different from nights. On the mountains, hunters found tracks that did not belong to deer or man-prints too long, too elegant, as if fingers had learned to walk. Far out at sea, fishermen swore the waves had a heartbeat. Deep beneath the snowline, in her half-living hall, Hel took inventory. Sickness, which once favoured the poor, now made no class distinctions. Kings arrived still smelling of smoke, queens with rings frozen to their fingers. Hel asked the same question, who will you be without your breath, and sent each to a fitting place. Up in Asgard, braziers never went out. Frost rained even the gold. Odin paced the length of his thought, wearing a groove in the floor. Ravens returned with the same report, colder, darker, no Thor. Thor stood on the walls until ice formed in his beard, watching for enemies that could not be struck. The air answered weakly. Patience grew brittle. In the cave, the serpent's jaw dripped. Sigyn's arms ached. When she emptied the bowl and the venom struck, Loki arched so hard the stone worried it might become water. He told himself the tremors above would loosen something. Between spasms he rested his head and listened for sounds a future might make. Fimbulwinter whistled faintly through cracks, a news no one could mishear. On a shore no map bothers to include. Shipwrights who did not know their craft built a vessel without knowing it. Nails sprouted from the dead as relatives forgot to trim them. To the living these were chores skipped. To the sea they were planks. Naglfar, the nail ship, conceived itself in pieces any time someone said, "Not today." It waited for a tide that knew the schedule better than priests. In Jotunheim, the ironwood shifted when no wind blew. Angerboda stood wrist-deep in snow, listening to messages Earth refused to translate. Somewhere, her son's breath steamed like an engine. Somewhere else, another child's coil nudged the horizon a thumb's width and laid its head down again. Sometimes she dreamed of a hall with a fire that would not die, sometimes of a bowl and an unshaking wrist. Tyr taught boys to hold shields so that other boys would live. His sleeve hung neat and empty, his voice never rose. They asked him when the cold would end. When the work requires it, he said. They did not understand. Understanding would have required peace, and there was none to spare. Heimdall woke from sleeps with the taste of metal in his mouth. He looked down on the bridge and spoke to it like a friend given a hard assignment. "Hold," he said, and the bridge held. Sometimes he heard a laugh far away in the howling, the laugh of a man who'd reached the end of pain and found a cliff beyond it. The Vanir counted stores with math that felt like prayer. Freya stared at the place his sword had hung and measured regret. Freya walked the granaries, telling grain to become more than itself. The grain wished to obey. Wishes brittle as ice fracture easily when carried. Some mortals learned to sleep in shifts. They braided hair like suns, roasted roots that tasted of apology, and invented new words for snow that meant we're not going to die tonight. Others walked into the white as if it contained a door. Sometimes it did. Sometimes you were the door, and you opened for others. Songs shifted from praise to instruction. Build low, stack dry, share early. When someone knocks, do not pretend you are not home. Jörmungandr dreamed of heat, coiled around the world. He felt villages fail and oceans stiffen. He tightened a fraction to stay warm and found himself measuring the seas in new units. Above him, ice floes collided like slow-thinking giants. Below him, vents spat minerals and silence. He slept and counted. Fenrir tested the ribbon the way a prisoner tests the rumour of mercy. The whisper-soft binds bruised him in ways iron had not. Tyr visited when others would not, feeding him meat and words. One day, Tyr said. Fenrir answered with a blink that meant both I know and I hate knowing. When the third winter forgot to become spring, people stopped measuring it in seasons. They counted names added to stories. Priests tried to own the explanation. Fishermen shrugged and owned the water. Children listened for creaks that meant a roof wanted help. A woman beat ice out of a blanket and laughed because the stick broke and the blanket did not. Sometimes survival is a joke that refuses to apologize. Then the signs clustered. Shirl and Heti ran too close to sun and moon. The sky coloured wrong for days. Earthquakes came not from a single scream, but a schedule of screaming. The bridge learned a new vibration and disliked it. The dead arrived in Hel's hall praising the one who told the truth at dinner, and Hel nodded as if she had been there. On the uncharted shore, the tide chose a day and came in like a verdict. Nigelfar lifted free with the cheerless grace of a thing that knew what it was for. The crew did not need lessons. Grief had trained them. A helmsman took the tiller whose hands had once trimmed nails and now did not. The prow looked south, then further south, then toward a sound that had not happened yet but was preparing its throat. Heimdall rose on the bridge, breath, palm on the horn. The note would be simple when it came, a straight line cut through cloth already tearing. He waited, because hearing is not only sound, it is timing. In the cave, the bowl filled. Sigurd's wrists shook, then steadied. Loki smelled a change in the venom as if the serpent had been fed a different diet of malice. The drop fell. The mountain answered, and the sea began to rhyme with itself in war. The sky fractured. Skirl caught the sun at last, its light tearing like fabric as the wolf's jaws closed around it. Hati snapped up the moon, leaving only stars that flickered like frightened witnesses. The world lurched into darkness, sudden and absolute. Fires refused to warm, crops froze in their furrows, and every living thing knew the story had reached the page where endings are written. From the sea rose Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent, heaving its coils free after centuries of silence. Waves broke over its back as it encircled the land, venom dripping into the ocean until the waters frothed green and deadly. On the plains, Fenrir strained against his fetters, and with a sound like mountains breaking, Gleipnir finally snapped. The wolf's roar shook every hall, every hut, every heart. His mouth gaped wide enough to swallow the horizon, flames spilling from his breath. The Gjalla horn sounded. Heimdall's blast was long and straight, a note that split every realm awake. It was not music, it was a command. Warriors rose, shaking in armour they knew would fail. The gods armed themselves. Odin mounted Sleipnir, his spear Gungnir balanced steady in his hand. Thor lifted Mjolnir, lightning answering his grip even through the dark. Freyr took his place with Skidbladnir and Gullinbursti, though the absence of his sword, a gift traded long ago, echoed louder than any horn. Naglfar cut the sea like a blade, its prow fashioned from nails of the dead. At its helm stood Loki, unbound at last, his eyes alive with fury and irony. Beside him marched the legions of Hel, half-rotted, half-whole, an army of grievances given flesh. The fire giant Surtur led them, his sword blazing hotter than suns. Each step he took cracked the earth into flame. They clashed on Vigrid, a field already scarred by prophecy. Odin charged Fenrir, his spear striking true, but the wolf lunged and swallowed him whole. Screams tore from Asgard as the All-Father vanished into jaws of fire. Yet Vidar, Odin's silent son, stepped forward. He planted his thick boot in the wolf's maw, prying it open, and with one savage thrust drove his blade upward, ripping through Fenrir's heart. The beast collapsed, but Odin was gone, and silence claimed the sky. Thor waded into Jormungandr's coils, hammer ringing against scales vast as hills. Lightning and venom battled in the dark. The serpent lashed, Thor struck, the clash echoing like the shattering of worlds. At last he crushed its skull with Mjolnir, venom spraying across the field. Thor staggered 3 steps, triumph burning in his chest, and then the poison overcame him. He fell beside his enemy. God and monster tangled in the same grave. Freyr faced Surtur. He fought with bravery, with fury, but without his sword his strength faltered. Surtur's fire consumed him, and the giant moved on, a furnace with no mercy. Heimdall sought out Loki, their eyes locking across chaos. They met in the centre, 2 watchers of different truths, one who guarded order, one who exposed its cracks. They struck, each wound mirrored, until they collapsed together, breath leaving them in the same instant. The battlefield howled, sky black and earth bleeding. Surtur raised his sword high, and with one sweeping arc he set the world aflame. Flames devoured forests, mountains, seas, until nothing remained but ash and the whisper of what had been. Yet in the crackle of that fire there was a strange quiet. The end had come exactly as foretold. But even prophecy has its pauses. Beneath the smoke, seeds of renewal waited, silent as breath between heartbeats. Ash settled like a second sky turned inside out. It drifted down in slow, stubborn sheets, blanketing ruins until edges softened and the memory of sharpness forgot itself. Where forests had been, low ribs of charcoal stuck up like blackened ship frames. Where towns had been, circles of stones cupped heat that had nothing left to warm. The sea hissed under the cinder snow, tasting bitter with serpent venom, then went quiet, as though even waves needed to rest. No voices carried, not wind, not prayer, not boast. The old world had been loud. The new one began in a hush. And then, because silence is only a bridge, never a country. The hush allowed a small human sound to cross the scrape of a heel against bark. A breath caught, a whisper that asked a single, ordinary question. Are you awake? 2 people lay beneath the roots of a tree that had somehow not burned. It had hollowed long before the flames and learned the patience of caves. Its roots wove a chamber shaped by centuries of holding on. They were thin, because the end of worlds does not serve second helpings. But their eyes were clear. The girl was Lif. The boy was Lifthrasir. They had survived not by fighting, but by listening. Listening for where fire refused to go, where water still insisted on being water, where a trunk still kept a secret dry simply because it had always done so. I'm awake, he said, and the relief in his voice sounded older than he was. He reached for her hand the way you reach for a rope in the dark, not to be pulled up, only to know the rope is there. They waited, measuring the air. No ash fell inside their root room. No smoke crawled along the ground. The ribs of the world had stopped creaking. When they crawled out, the daylight had the stunned look of someone who had witnessed too much. They stood very still and let their eyes learn the new horizon. A ridge of melted stone glassed the far hills the way a river freezes. In the near ground a pool steamed where a hall had stood. Above them the sky was not empty, it was thin, the way cloth thins at the elbow from years of use. It held. In that plain miracle, both of them felt something unclench. They did not speak for a long time because speaking makes promises, and they were not ready to promise anything yet. They walked instead, choosing their steps like words. When they found a fallen trunk unburned beneath its own damp bark, Lifthrasir pried at it with a splintered beam and exposed grubs fat as berries. They ate what the old world would have insulted and discovered it tasted like the new world's first kindness. They drank condensed dew from leaves that had somehow kept a gloss. They gathered the courage to say a future out loud. By the second noon they found a stream that still told its silver story. In its shallows, tiny fish flickered like leftover thoughts the fire forgot to erase. The two of them cupped water to their mouths and laughed because water still remembered its own music. On a low bank a patch of green had the nerve to be green. Lif knelt and pinched a stem between her fingers that smelled like the colour it was. They sat with their backs to a stone that had once been a threshold and let the warmth on its face climb into their shoulders. Elsewhere, other awakenings began without witnesses. In a valley shadowed from Surtur's sweep, a copse of birch unrolled new curls of leaf, shy and certain. On a black field, a vole tunnelled above ground because ground itself had moved upward. Across a cooled shoreline, gulls tested the air and decided there was enough of it to hold them. It was not forgiveness, exactly. It was continuity muttering, "Keep going." From the ash a breeze lifted, tried on the notion of becoming wind, and then committed. It carried scents the old gods would have recognized, and some they would not wet mineral. Burned salt, the soft metallic hint that always follows lightning. The stubborn sweetness of root pulp sliced clean. It also carried another sound, faint and far the plucked note of a string. It came from a man sitting on a stone at the edge of what had been a hall. He was not young by any mortal measure, yet the lines on his face seemed drawn recently, as if grief had taken up architecture. He held a harp cobbled from a doorframe and wire twisted out of chain. His right hand was whole, his left sleeve hung neatly where a hand had once been. Tyr tuned, listened, and tuned again. When the string found a pitch that matched the day, he let it ring. Sound made a path the feet were still afraid to take. He did not sing yet. Singing implies an audience. He played instead, giving the world a rhythm slow enough for survivors to find their breathing. Where the note stretched, Lif and Lifthrasir paused and cocked their heads. Where it fell, they moved. Tyr did not look up when they reached him. He did not need to. Music is a way of saying I see you without looking. You're early, he said softly. We're what's left. Lif answered. Is anyone else? Tyr's jaw set and loosened. Enough to begin, he said. Not enough to rest. They built a small camp where the hall's shadow still knew how to fall. Stones remembered their jobs and held heat. Tyr taught them to cut tinder from beneath brave bark and to borrow fire from places that still kept it. He showed them how to make a pot out of clay that had been a wall yesterday and a meal today. Lif listened with her body. Lifthrasir listened with his questions. When they slept, they did not dream of what had burned. They dreamed of what might root. On the third morning the sky surprised them. It brightened at a speed they could name. A crest of light climbed the edge of the world and hung there, pale and clean. And then a sun rose, smaller at first than its mother had been, as if careful not to brag. The daughter of the devoured sun took her place without ceremony. She did not scorch. She warmed. Shadows righted themselves. Somewhere snow admitted defeat. Tyr closed his eye and let his cheekbones take the light. He thought of oaths kept and oaths broken, of a wolf who had learned the taste of promises, of a ribbon that had held because nothing else could. He felt the ache of the missing hand as if the light touched it too. Loss does not vanish when day returns. It learns to stand beside you in line. When noon passed, a traveller approached along a line of cooled glass. His steps were deliberate, partly because the ground cut through old sandals, partly because a man who has seen the end takes care not to waste a beginning. He carried no weapon and every caution. When he reached them, he bowed his head and said a single name with a tenderness that made the syllables harmless. Balder. He stood there alive, light as if the air itself preferred him. Beside him, hand in hand, stood Herder. The twins of ruin and regret had returned. In the new sun their faces were almost too clear to look at. Balder's smile did not deny sorrow. It held it, and did not spill. Lif started to kneel without meaning to. Balder lifted a hand. Please, he said. No altars for a while. Let's build tables. Tyr kept his face steady, but his throat worked. He stepped forward, and for a long breath no one spoke. The wind shifted and carried the smell of something green cooking under itself. Huda tilted his head toward the music and asked Tyr, "Is that the sound of a world behaving?" Tyr almost laughed. "Not yet," he said. "But it's a start." "Where is Odin?" Lif asked, because children ask what adults organize into metaphor. The silence Balder answered with was kind, carried, He said, accounted for. He did not lie. The truth did not need sharpening. They ate what they had and shared what they didn't. It was not a feast. It was a practice. Balder and Hjörda told simple stories as if they were laying planks. Tyr showed them how to twist cord, how to stake a line, how to let water tell you which way it wanted to go and then agree with it. He did not mention Asgard. He did not mention a hall by the sea where jokes turned into indictments. Some things do not need retelling to be counted. That evening, as the small sun leaned and the shadows grew polite, another figure approached leading an animal that carried its own light. Freyr rested his palm against Gullinbursti's bristled neck and nodded to the camp with a tired strength that felt honest. He had no sword. The space where it would have been was not shame now. It was a lesson. Fields, he said by way of greeting, as if the word itself were an apology. We'll need them. We'll need fences to keep the boar from ploughing everything, Lifthrasir added, deadpan. Freyr blinked at the boy, then smiled for the first time since fire. You'll fit, he said. They dug that evening, Freyr guiding his shining boar along lines he drew with his heel. Soil that had known flame loosened under the animal's weight and admitted a softer future. Day followed day with the dignity of people who had run out of miracles and were not sorry. They learned that ashes both wound and promise. Lif mixed it into clay to make pots that did not crack on first heat. Lifthrasir found a spring that tasted like coins and argued with it until it admitted sweetness. Balder sang a low song that helped beans remember how to be beans. Freyr taught them to read the sky when the white ring around the sun is a warning, when it is simply pretty. They set a post and tied a strip of cloth to it, not as a banner but as a direction. Here, the cloth said to anyone who saw it, this is a place. Come if you can walk. Others did. A woman with hair cut blunt and clean, carrying a child who stared at everything as if he had invented it. Two brothers who fought in whispers because anything louder felt like theft. An old man who said nothing for 3 days and then spoke on the 4th in a voice like a door opening. Each brought something seeds they had found baked into old bread, a copper pot dented with someone else's history, a joke that still worked. Tyr taught, Balder listened, Freyr planted, Leif and Lifthrasir counted the ways you can be brave without swinging anything. On the 7th night, when the air no longer smelled entirely like yesterday's fire, Lif woke to a different hush, not empty anticipation. She stepped outside. The moon's daughter had risen in the new sky with a gentle authority, and under that light she saw a figure on the ridge, cloak simple, hair pinned. Sigyn stood there with a bowl cradled in her arms as if she had forgotten to put it down. Lif did not know her, but she knew the look of someone who had been holding something heavy for too long. Are you coming to camp? She asked, keeping her voice a little louder than a whisper but softer than a shout. Sigyn lowered the bowl and looked at her hands as if surprised they were empty. I was waiting to see if the world needed me, she said. It seems it does not, which means it does. They made a place for her without questions. She taught them how to line a trench so water will not sulk, how to carry 2 pails without bruising your shoulders, how to make a shelter behave like a friend. She did not talk about caves or serpents or the shape of screams. When a baby cried, she took it without performing wisdom and breathed until both of them remembered that breathing is a technique. In the mornings, smoke rose straight up. In the afternoons, it bent modestly and went elsewhere. A rhythm emerged: mend, plant, fetch, share, watch, sleep. No one called it civilization. No one needed to. They were too busy making it. News arrived like weather. From the north came reports of a stand of pines that had not surrendered. From the west, that a rockfall had revealed a seam of ore that rang pleasingly when struck. From the south, that a river had changed its mind and decided to be helpful. From the east, that 3 children had invented a game that required no ball and ended in laughter anyway. On a day that began as plain as bread, the sound of hooves ghosted across the ridge. A horse approached without rider, coat the colour of fog rubbed with charcoal. It moved as if it remembered 8 legs and had decided 4 would do. It stopped at the edge of the camp and lowered its head. Tyr's mouth pressed into a line. Balder put a hand on its neck and felt not ownership but recognition. Carry what needs carrying, he told it. The horse snorted once, as if to say, I was planning to... They built a longhouse with the careful arrogance of people who intended it to outlast their grandchildren. Posts went in deep. Beams argued and then cooperated. Over the doorway they carved not gods but tools. On the interior wall, Lif scratched a calendar with charcoal the days since fire, the days until harvest, the days they didn't need to count anymore because they had become the texture of living. At the edge of the fields, Freyr paused, hand on the boar's bright back. He looked toward a horizon where nothing yet demanded defense. There will be seasons, he said. Not all of them kind. Lifthrasir nodded and threw a stone at a post, just to hear the good sound. That night the air cooled without cruelty. People ate until full instead of until the bowl was empty. Tyr played the harp that had started as scrap. Balder listened. Hurdra held the rhythms in his body the way a blind man holds a path. Sigyn sat with a child asleep across her lap and let her shoulders be the quietest thing in the room. When the music ended, no one clapped. They did something rarer. They were still. Into that stillness, a different sound arrived, a distant subterranean creak, as if a hinge under the world had decided to move. The adults waited, because adults always wait for danger. The children went to the doorway, because children trust doors. On the far ridge, a figure outlined itself against the new stars. He was not tall as giants are tall, nor terrible as monsters are terrible. He was the size of a man who had paid for knowing more than he wanted to. His hair, in that light, looked like a promise kept and broken. He stood long enough for fear to consider itself and then to be told to sit down. Balder rose. Tyr set the harp aside. Sigyn did not move. The figure lifted a hand in greeting and did not come closer. Even from that distance, the curve of his mouth was not apology, not defense, something like acceptance scraping against its own grain. He turned his head as if listening to a river no one else could hear. The camp held its breath. "Tomorrow," he said, the word moving like a leaf the wind had decided to deliver rather than discard. Then he stepped back into the dark, and the ridge kept his place. No one slept quickly after that. No one panicked either. They arranged more logs on the fire and sat closer, not for heat, for intention. The little son's daughter crossed the roof quietly. Somewhere in the grass, a cricket unlearned and relearned its part. Lifthrasir leaned his shoulder against Lif's. "If that's the end," he whispered, "it's gentle." "If it's the beginning," she answered, "it's gentler." They laughed without showing teeth. When at last they lay down, the floor of the longhouse felt steady. Outside, Ash learned how to be soil. Inside, breath made rose like seeds. The camp slept the way the world sleeps after deciding not to die, and the stars above them looked less like witnesses and more like instructions. The night breathed, and nobody felt alone. Morning arrived shyly, as though uncertain it had permission to return. The camp stirred with the sound of water boiling in a clay pot, with the scrape of wood being shaped into handles, with children's voices testing how loud they were allowed to be. No one spoke of the figure on the ridge, but everyone carried his shadow quietly, the way one carries a bruise under clothing unseen yet always present. Balder walked the edge of the fields, watching green insist on itself. Hurdra followed by sound, staff in hand, his ears marking every step of the boar and every breath of his brother. Freyr bent low, pressing soil between his fingers. Tyr sat apart, plucking at his harp as if to test the honesty of the morning. Lif and Lifthrasir hauled water, spilling half of it, laughing because spilling meant there was enough to spare. Sigyn mended a cloak, her needle steady, though her eyes had not slept. By midday the horizon shivered. A line of shapes approached survivors, drawn by rumour of smoke rising straight. They came with hollow cheeks and stubborn feet. Some carried tools, some only stories, but all carried proof that the world had not burned everything. The camp grew without asking permission. Food stretched because it had to. The longhouse learned new names. That night, as stars crowded the dark, the ridge whispered again. The figure returned. This time he stepped closer, into the light of the fire. There was no mistaking him. Loki stood among them, not bound, not boasting. His hair was streaked with ash, his face cut with lines that had nothing to do with age. He looked like a man who had carried both guilt and fire through the same door and discovered they weigh the same. Thor was not there to swing a hammer. Odin was not there to pronounce judgment. The ones who faced him now were not a court but a community. Silence pressed against every chest. Lifthrasir's knuckles whitened around a cup. Sigyn did not move. She only breathed, and for once, Loki met her eyes without flinching. "I am not here to rule," he said. His voice cracked, not with weakness but with weight. I am not here to beg. I am here because the world kept me when it should not have, and I want to see what I ruined, rebuilt." No one answered at first. It was Balder who finally spoke, his voice soft but strong. "The past is carved. We cannot sand it smooth. But if you work, you stay. If you break, you leave. Those are the only laws we have." Loki nodded once, as if he had expected no kind of verdict. He sat by the fire, apart but not excluded. Children stared, wide-eyed, at the trickster of bedtime tales who now wore exhaustion instead of mischief. He told them nothing, offered no stories, but when one dropped a stick in the flames too soon, he reached out and pulled it free before sparks caught the thatch. The gesture was small, but in a world this fragile, small things mattered. Days bent into weeks. Loki worked alongside them. His cleverness turned practical nets mended, clay ovens sealed tighter, irrigation carved from stubborn rock. He laughed less. But when he did, it no longer cut. Sigyn walked beside him, bowl set aside at last, her silence now a choice rather than a burden. Balder watched carefully, never forgetting the past but refusing to let it strangle the present. Still, tension lived among them. Some whispered that Loki's presence invited disaster, that chaos does not reform, it only waits. Others argued that the world was already chaos, and survival demanded every hand, even a crooked one. The debate never ended, but each evening they ate together anyway. One dusk a storm gathered, sudden and sharp. Wind clawed at the new fields, threatening to undo fragile shoots. The people rushed to cover what they could. Nets tore, fires hissed out. Then, as lightning clawed the ridge, Loki strode into the gale. He shouted at the sky like an equal, staking ropes, driving stakes, daring the wind to argue. The storm raged and broke itself against his defiance. When it passed, the field still stood. No one cheered. They only exhaled in relief. But when Sigyn pressed a cloak around his shoulders, she did it with steady hands, not pity. Balder gathered them the next morning. "We are not gods anymore," he said. "We are keepers, of soil, of each other, of memory. If we forget that, the fire comes back." Heads nodded, even Loki's. The truth was simple, and in its simplicity lay its strength. The seasons returned, tentative but faithful. Crops grew. Children born after the flames took their first steps on soil that no longer smoked. Stories shifted. They still told of Fenrir and Jörmungandr, of Thor's hammer and Odin's bargains, but now they also told of Lif and Lifthrasir's root cave, of Sigyn's bowl, of Tyr's harp, of Baldr's forgiveness, and yes, of Loki, who stayed when leaving would have been easier. Under the new sun and new moon, the camp became a village, and the village became more. The longhouse filled with voices at night, and outside, fences and fields spread like careful handwriting across the earth. When travellers arrived, they were given a seat, not a test. The law remained the same: work, or leave. Most worked. One night, as flames cracked and sparks climbed into the dark, a child asked Loki why the old world ended. He looked at the boy for a long time, then said, "Because even gods forgot they could bleed. Remember that, and maybe we don't have to do it twice." No one spoke after. The fire carried the weight of his words into the night. The people slept, knowing their world was fragile, and that fragility was the very thing that made it worth guarding. And so the new age held not perfect, not endless, but alive. A story no longer about the doom of gods, but about the resilience of those who remained. Morning in the new village learned how to begin without asking permission. Smoke braided upward from low chimneys. Hens chattered in wooden pens made from doors that once guarded palaces. And water ran through ditches Loki had persuaded to act like small rivers. The world was not loud yet, but it had a different kind of confidence, the sound of work that expects to matter. Balder kept a ledger that was not a book, but a memory sorted by kindness. He walked the boundary stakes every dawn, greeting them like old comrades. Herder paced at his side, counting footfalls to know the distances by heart, mapping the village with a blind man's accuracy, the sort born from attention. Tyr tuned his rebuilt harp and listened as timber dried and changed pitch, the way a newborn voice changes within a week. Freya and the boar traced furrows so straight they looked like sentences the land had been waiting to read. Trust is never the same thing twice. Some days it was a cup the size of a thimble, some days it was a bucket you could bathe in. The village learned its measurements slowly. They watched how Loki spoke to children gently and to problems ruthlessly. They saw how he never stood in the doorway when storms rolled over the ridge. He went out into them, as if having once been a weather system himself, he could negotiate with the sky. When nets tore, he mended them with knots that lay flat, humble, obedient. When clay cracked, he sealed it with a paste he invented out of ash and stubbornness. He did not narrate his contrition. He lifted, carried, repaired. Yet memory is not a tool you put down. In the quiet before sleep, some replayed the old insults, the old court, the fall of a beloved god. They did not speak it, but they carried it, and he felt the freight of that carrying. Loki worked longer on those days, not to erase anything. Erasing is another form of lying, but to build a shelf sturdy enough to set the heaviest memory upon. One evening a caravan arrived from the coast, pulling a sled loaded with salt and stories. Among them was a woman with windburned cheeks and eyebrows as sure as the horizon who asked for the keeper of the ditches. When Loki lifted a hand, she studied him without flinching. "Your channels saved our field," she said. "They also stole our neighbours. Teach me the part where the water says yes to everyone." He liked her immediately because she believed water could be bargained with. He took her to the high place where he watched the valley change moods and showed her the trick: give the flood 2 options so it can choose to behave. She went away grinning, the way people grin when a problem bows slightly. Balder called meetings under the longhouse eave. They felt less like councils and more like a chorus rehearsal. People came with complaints and left with assignments. A man who wanted justice for a stolen chicken left carrying planks for a sturdier coop, and a joke about foxes that made him grin despite himself. Loki listened more than he talked, and then talked only enough to move the stuck thing forward by a single clever inch. The children were braver than their parents. One boy with a chin full of mischief asked Loki whether magic felt like lying that worked. Loki smiled, the small, honest smile he used like a password. "Magic feels like being patient with the rules until the rules want to surprise you," he said. The boy tried to square that with his own appetite for shortcuts and failed. The way honest answers often produce good confusion. At night, stories asked to be told. They came like neighbours, carrying bread. People wanted the old tales because new lives are steadier when they know what came before them. They asked for Thor, for Odin, for Freya's strings of tears, for the world's serpent whose shadow still coloured certain tides. What surprised them was how gently Balder told them. He did not sand off the blood, but he drew out the lesson underneath the spectacle, a trick of tone that turned cruelty into instruction, without pretending any wound had never happened. Loki listened from the doorway most nights, a silhouette that meant yes, and maybe. Sigyn alone could turn the room simply by standing. She spoke little, but when she did, it was to dignify the unglamorous. "Take extra twine," she would say, and the sentence became a proverb. "Boil the water even if it looks clean. Let the handle teach your hand where to hold." Mothers took those as lullabies. Traders repeated them as wisdom. Somewhere a poet who couldn't find a harp wrote them on his palm as if they were spells. From time to time the ridge produced visitors with the rough grace of trees that had outlived fire. Some were men and women who had worked under banners and now preferred chores. Some were singers with cracked voices. They wanted a reason to tune. Once, a woman came carrying a pouch of seeds she had defended with teeth during the flight from flames. She poured them into Sigyn's lap without explanation. Sigyn cradled them as if they were a sleeping animal, and then took them to a strip of soot-dark ground, humming to the rose as if the ground spoke that language. The boar slept beside the longhouse like a warm machine, rising at dawn to till whatever line Freya's palm traced. He had learned the shape of the village and grunted at the right jokes. If he ever remembered other battles, no one asked him to tell them. Tyr played in the doorway most evenings, one-handed arpeggios that sounded like conviction made audible. Herda tapped time, face tilted back, as if the roof itself were a drum. One afternoon a shout ran like a spark along the fence-line sail on the lake. Men and women stepped into the sun, shading their eyes. The craft rode low, lines clean. Stranger to this shore, when it beached, its crew disembarked slowly, stiff-legged with distance. They carried no spears. A woman with ash in her hair spoke first. "We heard a law," she said, Work or leave? Balder nodded. You heard correctly. She looked past him to Loki, recognized the history in his face, and did not quote it. We can bind rope, she said, and we can listen. That was audition enough. That night, under sky that had relearned its constellations, a debate as old as humans tried to start whether a past deed cancels a present one. It found no microphone. People were too busy making morning possible. Even those who still could not forgive discovered other verbs: measure, watch, guard, accept, refuse, insist. Forgiveness would be a later decision. Today had ditches to keep and roofs to comb for embers. Loki's hands learned new scars. Rope burn near the thumb, evidence of a day the wind tried to rehearse its old violence. A crescent of white across the palm from a clay shard pretending to be gentle. A pair of parallel lines on the wrist where a frightened dog had warned him it was not done grieving. He catalogued them like dates, useful for remembering which mistake belonged to which lesson. When the first harvest came small, imperfect, miraculous, they stacked sheaves with the reverence of a choir returning to pitch. No trumpets announced it, a single laugh did, ragged and relieved. Freyr blessed the field by walking it, until his boots wore a path that every child later tried to match foot for foot. Balder lifted a loaf as if it were a newborn and broke it cleanly. Hurdr tore his piece by sound and share. Sigyn salted a pot and said, "Enough," and the word meant plenty, which is the opposite of panic. After they ate, Balder stood and spoke about stewardship. He did not mention gods. He said neighbour, until the word held the weight prayer used to. He spoke of tending as a daily vow, and of stories as an irrigation system that keeps meaning from pooling where it will rot. People listened because every sentence supervised a task. The boy who had asked about magic performed his first trick. Then he palmed a stone and made it reappear behind his sister's ear. Loki applauded like any uncle would, which is to say too much, and then showed the boy how to bow like a conspirator instead of a hero. Share the secret with the person you trust most, he advised. Let the rest keep guessing. Guessing is a kind of hope. Letters returned, scratched in soot on birch bark, pressed into soft clay with a bird-bone stylus. A woman who had once counted taxes now counted jars and taught children how to make rows behave on a page. You are writing to your future self, she said. Be kind to that person. They will be tired. At the far end of the second year, a festival tried itself on. No crowns, no sacrifices, no thunder, just benches under a trellis that thought grapes might be possible someday. They traded stories the way other towns traded goods. A man from the lake offered the tale of a fish that sang when the wind was right. A grandmother countered with a memory of a lullaby that only worked if two people hummed. Tyr's harp stitched between them. Balder laughed so easily that for a blink everyone forgot what laughter had cost to relearn. Loki smiled at the sound and did not inventory it for leverage. Growth, it turned out, is a quiet decision repeated. Late that night, Loki walked the boundary and found the ridge holding a small figure the way a father holds a question. The figure did not turn. You owe me nothing, Loki said into the dark. You bought your life with endurance. I wrote mine in a currency that burned. The figure did not answer, because sometimes the world leaves you alone on purpose to see what you will build in the quiet. He stood until he felt dawn trying on the edges of the hills and then returned, because returning is a promise you practice. He woke to find a gift at his door, a small knife, handle wrapped in braid, blade ground from a broken scythe, no note. He understood the language. It said use this. It also said don't forget it can cut. He put it on his belt and behaved accordingly. In the third spring, travellers from far meadows brought a tale of a hall going up across the river, wood stacked clever, roof seated snug. They carve no gods, the traveller said, only hands. Balder's smile reached his eyes. Tyr tuned to a higher, happier key. Freya fed the boar an apple that glowed like a remnant sunset. Sigyn braided a girl's hair out on the stoop and hummed a melody the serpent could not interrupt. Not everything was gentle. Fire tried the forest again, mean and quick. This time watchmen rang iron bolts hung from lintels, and lines passed buckets hand to hand until the flames settled for a sulk. A sickness tested the infants. Sigyn's cool cloths and stubborn patience outlasted it. A pair of knife-thin thieves tested the granary and found it guarded by a grandmother whose broom understood tactics. At dawn they were sweeping. The village exhaled, and work quietly claimed the morning. Seasons folded into each other until people stopped counting them as victories and started calling them life. The village no longer looked like a camp stubbornly refusing to vanish. It had streets not planned, but worn into place by repetition. It had smells bred, tilled soil, fish pulled from lakes that remembered serpents but no longer feared them. It had laughter layered enough that children believed laughter was natural, not reclaimed. And it had memory, sharp as any blade, sitting in its centre like a fire that burned without smoke. Balder became less a leader and more a keeper of tone. When voices sharpened, he softened them. When work lagged, he quickened it with stories about why the effort mattered. His brother Herder listened always, hearing moods the way other men hear weather. Freyr turned the fields into sentences that taught themselves to keep going. Tyr's harp grew more confident, its one-handed chords now complex enough to sound like entire landscapes, and Loki bent his cleverness into scaffolding. He patched mistakes, cut shortcuts into honest paths, and muttered jokes only half the room dared to laugh at. Sigyn stayed quiet but never background. When she placed her hand on a sick child's forehead, fever often remembered its place. When she tied a beam with her plain knots, roofs remembered to hold. No one asked her to explain the past, and she offered no sermons about caves and serpents. But everyone sensed that the steadiness of their days balanced on the patience she had carved from years of holding bowls. No one else would. Still, every paradise carries tension. One evening, a group of young men, too young to remember the old world's cruelty and too restless to accept its lessons, whispered about testing limits. They spoke of forging weapons just in case. Balder heard, and instead of forbidding, he called them to the fire. He let them explain their hunger for redness. Then he told them the story of Fenrir, not as doom, but as parable. We bound him because we feared him. Balder said, fear turned prophecy into chains, and chains turned prophecy into truth. Ask yourselves if we sharpen blades now. Do we make the danger or prevent it? The young men went silent, because the story did not scold. It held a mirror. In the morning, their forge work turned to plowshares. Lif and Lifthrasir grew into the roles their names promised life and the one who clings to life. They planted groves of fruit trees and taught children how to braid branches so storms would not break them. They laughed often, argued more often, and loved with the stubbornness of people who believed the future was worth bruises. When their first child was born, the village gathered outside the longhouse and listened to the newborn cry. It sounded less like sorrow and more like confirmation. Loki watched the child with a gaze no one could read. Some thought he envied innocence, others thought he feared it. Sigyn touched his arm once, grounding him, and he did not pull away. That night he sat apart, whittling a toy from driftwood, his knife flashing soft under the moon. By morning the toy lay at the family's door, a crooked horse with charm enough to be loved. No note, no name, just wood and intention. Time layered gently but also carried edges. Strangers still arrived, some desperate, some hopeful. The law remained work or leave. Most worked. A few tested the rule, and when they did, the community enforced it not with blades but with silence sharp enough to drive anyone away. Exile, they learned, can be colder than winter, and in a world that had already endured too much cold, most chose warmth. Stories shifted. Children asked less about Thor's hammer or Odin's spear. They wanted instead the tale of Sigyn's bowl, of Tyr's harp, of the day Loki fought the storm instead of fleeing it. The old gods became echoes, useful but not central. New myths formed in real time, myths of survival, of patience, of repair. And that was the quiet revolution. They no longer waited for gods to define them. They defined themselves. One autumn, when the fields bent heavy with grain, Balder walked to the ridge and looked across the valley. Ash had turned to soil, ruins to stones for new walls. He felt no need to summon visions or prophecies. The sight was enough. Loki joined him there, hands on his knees, breathing as though the climb had taken more from him than he liked to admit. They stood together. No words at first. Then Loki said, I thought the end would taste bitter forever. But this, he gestured to the patchwork below, this tastes different. Balder did not answer right away. When he did, it was simple. That's because you're not eating alone. Winter came again, softer this time. Snow lay on roofs without cruelty. Rivers slowed but did not freeze to silence, and fires burned because people tended them, not because they begged them. In the longhouse, Tyr played, Sigyn hummed, Freya laughed when the boar snored too loud, and children invented games out of nothing. Even Grief learned how to sit politely in the corner, no longer demanding the entire room. On the first night of that winter, Balder lit a torch and planted it in the centre of the village. This, he said, is not for worship. It is for memory. We remember who we were so we can decide who we are. The fire burned steady, and around it people told stories not of doom this time, but of beginnings. Loki sat among them, his smile tired but real, and for once, no one looked at him with suspicion. The village did not call itself eternal. Eternity had failed them once already. Instead, they called themselves enough. Enough to rise, enough to fall, enough to begin again and again. And in that modest creed lay a strength even the gods of the old world had never mastered. The stars leaned close, as if listening. The new sun's light waited patiently beyond the horizon, and the people survivors, keepers, builders rested without fear that the dawn would forget them.